Welcome, Adam Guskich on the show. So great to have you on. How are you today?
I'm great, Anthony. Thanks very much for having me. Great to be here as well.
It's an absolute delight to have you on the show because we've never had a guest of your level of expertise talk about medicinal cannabis. So the listeners are certainly going to be tuned in to wanting to know more about medicinal cannabis and how it can help in relation to health ailments that they may be experiencing or a loved one may be experiencing. So really keen to rip into this discussion. But before we get underway, keen to hear your backstory, Adam, as to how you have arrived at what you're doing today.
Absolutely. Look, an interesting backstory in a way, Anthony. Medigrowth was established in 2017. So myself and co-founder Todd McClellan founded Medigrowth in late 2017. And it had really been based around several conversations and watching the industry grow in other parts of the world and looking at what was happening here in Australia in really the nascent form of the industry after the legalisation in 2016 here in Australia. So Todd, my co-founder, is a Canadian expat. He's lived in Oz for 25 plus years, married a good Aussie girl, and found his way over here many moons ago. But still has a very strong connection to Canada and, in fact, still has family in Canada in British Columbia. And BC has been really an epicenter of medicinal cannabis industry based on, much of the, the advancements that they made from their medicinal framework that was implemented 20 plus years ago in Canada. So that was really the basis. We had a strong personal connection, equal connection to an industry in North America, which has really been a driver of the medicinal cannabis industry globally. And that prompted several trips to Canada and the States over the course of a couple of years, really looking, learning and establishing what we felt Australia may see in a medicinal framework and how we may be involved in that. So that was the beginning, and it's been really a roller coaster ride of implementing a host of initiatives as a new business in a new industry, in a completely new framework, legislative framework that's equally been evolving over that time. So, during that time, Medigrowth has really evolved substantially as well. We've become fully licensed as a medicinal cannabis cultivator for research and development and manufacturing. So we have the full licensing framework across the ODC and TGA. We have medicinal cannabis products in the market currently being prescribed by Australian doctors and medical professionals. And we're very closely aligned to university to really drive some of our clinical research and long-term endeavours, which is very much focused around the establishment of registered TGA cannabinoid medicines. So there's been a huge amount of work that's been done over the course of these last few years to really position us still at an early phase of not only company development but industry development. But it's been very, very exciting. We've watched a whole host of players in the Australian and global industry go from zero to quite significant companies in some cases. And the Australian market is exciting because we're seeing not only Australian players doing great things, but really positive results for Aussie patients. And that's ultimately what it's about.
And what excites you the most about the health benefits that you're seeing through your research and your collaboration with Deakin University?
I think it's very much the beginning of a mainstream facilitation of medicinal cannabis. We've seen a ground-up perspective of this medicine coming in from an Australian framework position really back in 2017 when companies were fighting for, market share in single-digit prescription placements over the country to now a position where There are a number of companies distributing medicinal cannabis across Australia, and we're seeing month-on-month growth in terms of the way those products are being prescribed through the TGA Special Access Scheme, authorised prescribers and clinical trials. So we're seeing such significant growth in the patient uptake and in turn in the doctor uptake. And it's really highlighting the fact that there is significant therapeutic benefit here. We're seeing a huge amount of affirmation from doctors and patients that we deal with that they are having life-changing benefits from the medicine that they're receiving. And I think for me personally, that's what motivates me. You know, when I start to talk to people where they're telling me that this has totally changed their life, or, you know, their broad family life, if they're a carer or if they're dealing with, you know, challenges within their family due to disease states or indications. So for me, I find it incredibly exciting to really be part of the grassroots development of an industry, but really equally probably trying to see how we as a company, how Medigrowth can position ourselves within that industry to really drive that legitimacy, because at the moment, I think it's fair to say there's still a degree of work to be done to ensure that medicinal cannabis is viewed as a mainstream medicine and not an alternative medicine. There's a real crossover between, you know, one end of pharmaceuticals and the other end of medicinal cannabis, and somewhere in between, I think, is a happy medium for medicinal cannabis and pharmaceutical grade cannabinoid medicine. So, you know, if you look at, if you look at the main indications, there are now dozens of indications that are getting approved for medicinal cannabis approvals through the TGA. The lion's share, I guess, in terms of numbers, are going to chronic pain and anxiety, insomnia related conditions. So if you look at the stats, certainly chronic pain and anxiety related conditions, which can include things like insomnia and PTSD and depression, a wide spectrum of indications along those lines, people are getting quite substantive results in many cases. So, but the spectrum of treatment range is quite phenomenal. I mean, that TGA portal, if people choose to go on and have a look at the indications that are being approved, it's everything from the ones I mentioned through to things like Parkinson's disease, through to migraines, through to generalised sort of chronic pain conditions, but a whole host of conditions that are somewhat sidelined, I guess, in mainstream medicine as well.
That's incredible to hear the broad spectrum of diseases it's supporting at the moment, and it's great to see that there's growing use amongst the medical professionals in terms of using it as an alternative to pharmaceutical drugs, and it's getting really promising results from what I'm hearing. Have you got any stories, client stories that you've heard along the traps in terms of your work, in terms of that life-changing benefit around medicinal cannabis use?
Look, we're certainly talking to a number of doctors and a number of patients in terms of some of the results that they're having. I've had a number of doctors tell me that for the first time in their careers, they are seeing quite incredible positive change for patients. And I think that's really important to note, that mainstream GPs, who in many cases had come on slightly sceptical about medicinal cannabis based on, you know, an age-old stigma of the plant itself, in some cases have been completely turned around in terms of their opinion on the therapeutic benefits. And in terms of individual patient stories, I mean, there's a number of stories that we hear almost on a daily basis where patients are saying this has really been quite life-changing for them. And that's, in some cases, a complete transition from medications that they've been utilising, traditional pharmaceutical medicines that they've been using for, you know, years in some cases, that have almost become a habitual prescription, often living with quite adverse side effects that are unwarranted in many cases. You know, things, often people that are for example, dealing with insomnia. It seems quite a benign indication, but it can actually have very life limiting effects when people are struggling to get their required rest. So things like that, where traditional pharmaceuticals can be replaced with a more natural alternative for an equally good result, but without many of the side effects, are very, very beneficial. In terms of some of the work, so we're involved in some clinical trial initiatives through our involvement with Deakin University and some of the other organisations that we deal with. That's prompted some engagement with a number of GPs and specialists who have an interest in paediatric autism, for example, and in turn, many of the indications that we're seeing quite significant rates of here, not only in Australia but globally, things like ADHD, for example, and often these disorders are ineffectively treated with the pharmaceuticals that are being prescribed. So we've had very, very good feedback from a number of those doctors that are supplementing or replacing those pharmaceuticals with CBD in the case of autistic and ADHD children, but equally some products that have a degree of THC in them as well, that of course needs to be very carefully managed, but under the careful supervision of a medical professional, there is a place for THC products as well.
Yeah, so just shifting to that, back to that paradigm that you've been having to work with doctors in terms of their understanding of the uses of marijuana, and I guess they're thinking of the recreational use and people getting stoned and that sort of I guess then they think, well, why would I want to prescribe that sort of drug to someone? So just how are you shifting this paradigm? Because there'll be listeners that are also thinking about, well, I saw people stoned under the influence of marijuana and I didn't like what I saw, and I don't really want to give this to my children to treat ADHD or autism. So what is it that's different about what you're prescribing to what the recreational users are doing with it?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a combination of answers to that question. Firstly, medicinal cannabis is quite a broad umbrella for a number of different compounds, and the main two compounds that are being utilised are CBD, which is cannabidiol, or THC, which is the psychoactive component of the cannabis plant. So there are products out there that can be isolated CBD, which have no psychoactive effects, for example. So they're the products that CBD has been deemed by the World Health Organization to be a safe and well-tolerated compound with really no potential for abuse. So that compound in its own right is being widely prescribed across the world, and in certain parts of the world it's far less regulated than it is here in Australia as well. We still have it as a prescription-only medicine, a Schedule 4 medicine. Varying other parts of the world have far less rigorous safeguards around CBD because of that World Health Organization prioritisation of where it sits in the scheduled drugs position. So I think that's one part of it that really it depends on what you're being prescribed. But beyond that, THC, which is a psychoactive compound, needs to be very well managed. And I think the difference is when you're talking recreationally, firstly, any products prescribed here in Australia are produced under, if they're made here in Australia, produced under AU GMP. So the Medigrowth products are all Australian-made AU GMP products, so pharmaceutical grade, consistent quality, lab tested to ensure that what's on the label is what's in the bottle, versus a recreational world where no one knows exactly what they're getting or the source, and the quality and consistency of those products is obviously very questionable. So in terms of managing, there's firstly the quality control of the product itself, but then there's that overarching medical supervision to ensure that patients are getting the right guidance, dosing guidance to ensure that they are utilising that medicine responsibly. And in many cases, THC can be microdosed, so it can be dosed to ensure that the psychoactivity is managed. And in fact, CBD is known to equally manage some of that psychoactivity as well. So many of the balanced products that have CBD and THC in them can be dosed accordingly to ensure that people are getting the right therapeutic benefit. But it is certainly sorry, go on.
No, there you go.
I was going to say it is certainly an issue that needs to be well managed, and from our perspective, we're very conscious of that. Certainly, there are some cases in paediatric medicine where doctors will make a decision that some degree of THC may be beneficial for the patient, but it's used with extreme caution and under, obviously experienced medical supervision. But it comes down to, like any medicine, a risk profile based on particular patient history. So in some cases, that risk profile may be well warranted, and in others it isn't. And that's something that only a medical professional can really speak to.
So when you mention medical profession, there's the one you've been mentioning continuously is the GP. What about pharmacists? Are they also under the umbrella of medical professional? And who else fits under that umbrella of medical professional that can prescribe the right amount of concentrations of CBD and the ratio with THC, or if needed or required for that condition?
Yeah. So basically, in Australia, all medicinal cannabis products need to be prescribed by a registered doctor. So whether that's a CBD or a THC product, they need to come under prescription that's then dispensed at a pharmacy. So pharmacists are in a position any pharmacist can dispense those medicines. So a patient that can take their prescription, no different to any other traditional pharmaceutical, to their local pharmacy and have that prescription filled. And there are then some specialist pharmacies and equally some specialist medicinal cannabis clinics that are probably, or potentially in some cases, more experienced in not only the prescribing and just the general experience in terms of ratios and dosing and patient indications, but also some of those pharmacists that are regularly dealing with patients that will have more experience across some of the general questions that patients may have for a pharmacist. So there's a number of educational initiatives happening for both GPs and pharmacists to ensure that they are up to speed with all of the not only the regulations, but just with the overall guidelines, I guess, for medicinal cannabis, and to ensure that they have the relevant expertise to deal with some of those patient inquiries. And if you look at
and in terms of the doctors that are working actively, sorry, I was talking over the top of you, but
go ahead.
In terms of the doctors that are actively working with the medicinal cannabis, is there like a list on a website that the listeners can go to? Do you have it on your website? Or like, I'm just thinking that not every GP is actively looking at cannabis for their patients. So how do the listeners actually find a GP that's willing to work with medicinal cannabis?
It's a very good question, because you're right. There are some. I find personally, I'm dealing with a number of inquiries where patients have spoken to their local GP, who has said that they're either not willing or not in a position to prescribe, even though legally they are. Obviously, if a doctor doesn't feel as though they have the adequate scientific sort of knowledge or background behind the products, they may choose not to prescribe. So there are a number of dedicated medicinal cannabis clinics, and in a lot of cases, those are being serviced by authorised prescribers. So there's now 700 plus, I think, authorised prescribers across the country who are very experienced cannabinoid prescribers. And that's based on some of the education done to bring themselves up to a level of experience in terms of products and the broad cannabis framework. So patients can access through, yes, their GP, if their GP is happy to sort of go on that journey with them. And often I think it's fair to say, in my experience with a lot of GPs, if they're willing to spend the time, medicinal cannabis is something a lot of doctors have said to me. It's really a matter of starting with the dosing at a very low rate. It's that dosing and titration regimen that I think takes a little bit of time for individual patients to work through. It's not one size fits all. I think that's well established. Every individual has a endocannabinoid system within their body, and every individual deals with the introduction of cannabinoids from the medicine quite differently within their own system. So that dosing regimen, I think, just needs to be established. So to find the right doctor, and it's probably no different to finding the right doctor in any walk of life. I think sometimes it's a matter of actually finding the fit, and whether that's the local GP that you've been going to forever. I know when I started in this industry, I spoke to my local GP just about his overall view of medicinal cannabis, his experience, and he was very upfront with me, and he said, look, I know nothing about it, and I won't prescribe it until there's more genuine, rigorous, scientific, clinically backed evidence around the products that are being prescribed. Now, that was probably 5+ years ago, so a lot's actually changed in that time. So the doctors that maybe aren't in a position to prescribe, for example, if the listeners wanted to have a chat to us, we have a number of doctors that are not linked to Medigrowth, but we know are authorised prescribers with a high level of experience. So that would really just be a matter of jumping onto the Medigrowth website, which is medigrowth.com.au, and would be happy to make some introductions there. And many of those can be either region-specific or in a COVID or post-COVID world. So much is being done on telehealth now that it really doesn't matter where people are based. There's an expert out there somewhere in the country that would be happy to help.
And for the listeners, I'll include that link directly to the Medigrowth website in the show notes. So you can just go directly to the show notes, click on the link, and it'll take you to Medigrowth's website. I'm just really excited to hear more about the collaboration arrangement you're doing with Deakin University around particularly the study with autistic children and medicinal cannabis. That excites me because I'm seeing, autism pop up in clinic on a constant basis. ADHD is another one. And I have parents coming to me with great concern about these things and not wanting to put them directly onto pharmaceutical drugs at such a young age, which I can totally understand. And so I'm really keen to find out if you've got any latest research to share on these areas of ADHD and autism.
Sure. Yeah, look, from our perspective, as a company, we saw really this pharmaceutical framework that the medicinal cannabis industry is under here in Australia as a great opportunity to really try and partner with the right institutions to drive forward some of that clinical evidence, the very evidence that my GP was talking about being a lack of, many years ago, to try and ensure that we can bring cannabis medicine into the mainstream. And I think we quite regularly say it internally here at Medigrowth that really at some point in the future we'll be talking not about medicinal cannabis, we'll just be talking about another medicine that just happens to be derived from the cannabis plant. And that's our intention when we start to look at how we can really have an impact in the industry. For us, there are a lot of things that we're doing, but our long-term approach to this industry is how can we really place our stake in the research and the clinical arena, and that's with randomised, Australian golden standard clinical trials. And that's really what we're looking to do based on our collaboration with Deakin. So we established very early in our company development, we established a collaboration with Deakin University, which includes a co-located research greenhouse. So we are working on a number of fronts with not only Deakin, but with a number of universities across the country to really ensure that we're working on not only the plant science on one end of the scale, but really on the clinical science on the other end of the scale, and somewhere in the middle, those two will marry up to have the right products coming out of the greenhouse and being initiated into the clinical trial work that we'll be doing in the future. In terms of the autism trial, there's a strong link already within Deakin University in terms of their neurocognitive and science unit. So there was a direct sort of synergy between their interest in obviously their clinical work with the autistic population, and equally globally recognition that CBD is having a therapeutic benefit on autism, and in turn some of the comorbidities of autism, epilepsy being one of those indications that is very often comorbid with autism. So epilepsy already has been unequivocally clinically proven to be well served with CBD. There are registered FDA and TGA medicines in the market that are being distributed for pediatric epilepsy with quite, again, life-changing results. So we know that the product definitely has a link and has a fit into this patient cohort. And there are a number of studies both in Australia and globally that are looking at a number of these areas, including autism and ADHD and Tourette syndrome, and a host of indications that share degrees of disorder within those varying states. So from our perspective, we were very excited to get involved in that project because it's a continuation of, one, the relationship, two, really it's a pilot program for a number of other clinical trial initiatives, because much of that data that comes from phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, when they're done under such robust scientific engagement, can have crossover into other clinical areas as well. So it's very exciting, and I think from both sides, from the academic research, from the clinical side of actually dealing with the patient population, and from a company perspective to learn about the results of that data collection, it's all incredibly valuable. So it's a mutual benefit, and for us, very exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, no, it's great to see some local research and in a very, very useful area, particularly with the growing rates that are happening amongst the community of these neurological causes, I guess, diseases or ailments that we're seeing with children that become very concerning for parents, and they're looking for alternatives. So it's great to see that there's an alternative out there, and that's getting great results. So well done, and thank you for doing the great work and getting it more mainstream within Australia in terms of the offering of what the listeners, or certainly the parents out there, can access for their children. In terms, Adam, have you got any concluding words in terms of your vision? In terms of where you see this industry going in the near future.
It's an incredibly exciting and I think what history of this industry has told me over a very short space of time, that it's a rapidly changing and rapidly evolving industry. So in Australia, there are already so many supply chain ends to this industry. So, where we sit is really a multi-stage point in that supply chain. So we have a number of operations across distribution, clinical trials, and for us, the next stage is really looking to develop local sovereign manufacturing capabilities and really build upon our research work that we're doing in terms of the plant science. So we have proposed a major development for a cannabinoid centre of excellence, which includes a manufacturing and genetic and R&D cultivation space that we really foresee being almost a research hub, not only for ourselves, but for university and global organisations utilising Australia as really that footprint of research and quality assurance that I think the world continues to see Australia as. So for us as a company, that's really the next steps. But I think within those big picture plans, we'll continue to really focus on those patient-driven endeavours. And those, for us, the patient-driven endeavours are factored around the clinical trials, because to get medicinal cannabis away from something that's still a special access medicine to something that is purely a prescription-based medicine that's registered, that's on the PBS, that then leads to affordability for patients, that's really the only way that these medicines can be fully accessible to any Australian, regardless of their financial situation. So for us, that's the big picture. We want to continue to drive the scientific endeavour behind not only the starting point of autism trial, but really looking at that as the jumping off point to ensure that Medigrowth is really at the forefront of a clinical trial pipeline in cannabinoid pharmaceutical development, because that's, for us, if that can be established, we're still talking about a natural product, but the pathway is just falling into the framework that Australia currently works within, and that then opens access to every Australian at an affordable entry point. So that's the next steps for us, and we'll continue jumping out of bed every day, working through so many of the avenues that we see for us as a company and in terms of our business development to implant ourselves here, not only in Australia, but as a global success story.
And that you truly are on the journey to becoming. It's fantastic, in terms of this opportunity to speak with you, Adam, from Medigrowth, and really excited to, keep up the speed with your developments and where you're at with your research, and share that with the listeners as you do more and more, clinical studies, and we can certainly give that insight to and share it with the listeners. And to the listeners, I thoroughly, suggest you to go to their website to find out who can prescribe, or at least be open to prescribing this for whatever ailments that you're seeking help for, whether it be the ones such as pain, insomnia, anxiety that were spoken about on the show, and then the more newer ones around children, neurological development issues such as the ADHD and autism. I really recommend you go to Medigrowth's website and find someone that can really help you in this space in terms of alternatives to traditional medicine. So, Adam, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Anthony. Thank you very much for having me, and absolutely welcome any insight or questions, or if there's any connections I can make to any of the listeners out there, whether it be from an industry perspective or a patient perspective. Our motto really from day one has been that for industry to succeed here in Australia, there needs to be collaboration, and we all need to be really working towards the ultimate goal of how we can bring patients and industry together. So that's very much from my perspective. Happy to make those introductions if need be.
Fantastic. Well, where do they find those contact details of yours? On the Medigrowth website, or is there something else you'd like to share?
Yeah, look, I think that's a good starting point. I'm always happy, whether it's from a patient perspective, there's a number of resources that we can share. And certainly on the website, there are some resources in terms of ebooks and some general education and awareness initiatives there in terms of what the steps are for patients and how some of those indications are currently being served with medicinal cannabis. And equally, if there was a specific question, certainly happy just via the contact us on the website. Feel free to reach out and we'll do our very best to help.
Fantastic. In the show notes, listeners, go directly there and you'll find the link to Medigrowth's website. And in the meantime, if you've really liked the episode, please share it with your friends. Get it out there to as many people as possible, because we really need to get the word out there that there's such great help in terms of additional access and support for health ailments that, you can be treated beyond pharmaceutical drugs, and you can do it all through your GP. And so tune in for more insightful episodes and keep up to date with what's happening with Medigrowth's growth.
Good on you, Anthony. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.